Winter had settled over Ashworth Manor like a shroud, thick and unrelenting, the kind of cold that seeped through stone walls and lodged itself in the marrow of one's bones. Snow blanketed the Derbyshire hills in oppressive white silence, transforming the estate into something beautiful and terrible, at once a prison of frost and propriety, where even the ancient oaks stood skeletal and withdrawn, their bare branches scratching against leaden skies as if trying to escape their own roots. It was in this landscape of magnificent desolation that Lady Eleanor Hartley, now the Duchess of Ashworth, had existed for 3 months. Though existed seemed the only appropriate word, for she had not truly lived, not in any meaningful sense, since the day she had arrived as a bride to a man who looked through her as though she were made of glass, or perhaps of nothing at all. The manor itself seemed to conspire in her invisibility, vast corridors that swallowed footsteps, cavernous rooms that echoed with absence, portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose painted eyes followed her movements with what she imagined was pity or perhaps disdain for her failure to animate the cold heart of their descendant. Sebastian Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth, was as remote and unyielding as the winter itself, a man carved from the same unforgiving stone as his ancestral home, handsome in the way that glaciers are beautiful, distant, untouchable, capable of grinding whatever came too close into insignificance. Eleanor had learned his patterns in those 3 months, the careful choreography of avoidance that governed their separate lives beneath the same roof. He departed early for estate business, dined in his study, retired late to chambers as far from hers as the manor's geography would allow, and when they did occupy the same space at the occasional formal dinner, in passing through the portrait gallery, his gaze would slide past her with such practiced indifference that she had begun to wonder if she had become a spectre, a restless ghost haunting her own marriage. She had tried in those early weeks, tried with a desperation that now made her cheeks burn with remembered shame. Small attempts at conversation over breakfast, observations about the estate, questions about his day that hung unanswered in the air between them, like frost crystals, beautiful and fragile and ultimately meaningless. The loneliness had a weight to it, a physical presence that pressed against her chest as she wandered the empty rooms, her fingers trailing along dusty spines in the library, her footsteps the only sound in gardens gone dormant and silent. This was not what she had imagined when her father had announced the arrangement, when she had stood in her family's drawing room and accepted her fate with the quiet dignity expected of a gentleman's daughter, harboring secret hopes that perhaps affection might grow between them, that perhaps she might matter to someone, that perhaps she might finally be seen. The arrangement had been negotiated in her father's study on a rain-soaked afternoon in late spring, the kind of mercenary transaction that occurred regularly among families of their class, where daughters were currency and alliances were purchased with carefully worded contracts and the exchange of land deeds that meant more than any human heart ever could. Eleanor had not been present for the discussion. Of course, such matters were considered too indelicate for feminine sensibilities, but she had understood the necessity from the moment her father had called her into the library afterward. His expression, a mixture of relief and something that might have been apology, explaining that the Duke of Ashworth, recently widowed and in need of an heir, had agreed to accept her hand, that the marriage would secure her future and restore some of the family's dwindling fortunes, that she should consider herself fortunate to be matched with a man of such distinguished lineage, even if his reputation suggested a certain coldness of temperament. The wedding had taken place 6 weeks later at the ancient church in the village near her family's estate, a ceremony of exquisite beauty and absolute emotional emptiness, the kind of event where every detail was perfect, the flowers, the music, the bride's gown of ivory silk that had belonged to her grandmother, and yet nothing felt real, as though she were watching herself from a great distance, observing a stranger speaking vows to a man whose hand was cold when he slipped the ring onto her finger, whose eyes when they met hers held nothing but polite vacancy, whose kiss at the altar was so brief and perfunctory that she barely registered it before he was already turning away. She had harbored hopes despite everything, small, fragile seedlings of possibility that perhaps once they were alone, once the performance of the wedding was complete, he might soften, might reveal some warmth beneath the aristocratic reserve, might see her as something more than a contractual obligation, but the wedding night had disabused her of such fantasies. He had been correct and dutiful and utterly disconnected, treating the consummation of their marriage as another item to be checked off a list of requirements, and afterward he had retired to his own chambers without a word, establishing the pattern that would define their existence together. Those first weeks at Ashworth Manor had been a slow erosion of every romantic notion she had ever entertained, each day bringing fresh evidence of her irrelevance. She would arrange herself in the morning room where she thought he might take breakfast, only to learn he had already departed. She would select topics she imagined might interest him, mentioning books she had read or observations about the estate, receiving in return monosyllabic responses or silence. She would sit in the drawing room in the evenings, needlework abandoned in her lap, listening to the clock mark hours until she finally accepted he would not join her, that this was to be her life, existing parallel to a man who had married her in body but refused to acknowledge her presence in any meaningful way. Two strangers sharing a surname and nothing else, separate lives conducted under the same roof, with all the warmth and intimacy of distant planets orbiting in their lonely prescribed paths through the void. Eleanor's days had taken on the quality of a recurring dream, each one indistinguishable from the last, a careful choreography of absence and silence that she performed with the mechanical precision of a clockwork figure, moving through the vast rooms of Ashworth Manor like a spirit condemned to haunt spaces that would never acknowledge her presence. She woke each morning to an empty bed in chambers that might as well have been a mausoleum, dressed with the help of a kind but pitying lady's maid who said little and saw too much, and descended to the breakfast room where she would find evidence of Sebastian's earlier presence, a cup drained of coffee, a newspaper folded with military precision, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in air that seemed colder for his having already departed, and she would sit alone at the long mahogany table, picking at toast she had no appetite for, listening to the tick of the ormolu clock marking seconds that stretched into eternities. The mornings she devoted to exploring the manor, walking corridors lined with portraits of Blackwood ancestors who stared down at her with expressions ranging from imperious disdain to melancholic resignation, as though they too had known what it meant to be trapped in this beautiful, terrible place. And she would find herself in the library, that cathedral of leather-bound volumes where dust motes danced in weak winter light, pulling books from shelves with no particular purpose, reading passages that might as well have been written in languages she didn't speak, for all the meaning they carried when her mind could focus on nothing but her own irrelevance. The gardens, even in their winter dormancy, offered a kind of solace, and she would bundle herself in furs and walk the frozen paths between skeletal rose bushes and snow-covered hedges, her breath forming clouds that dissipated as quickly as her attempts to matter. And sometimes she would encounter Sebastian in the distance, striding toward the stables or across the south lawn with his estate manager, and she would pause, waiting to see if he might acknowledge her, might raise a hand or alter his course, but he never did, his gaze sliding past her as though she were merely another statue in the garden, another ornamental feature of the landscape that required no attention. She tried, still, in those weeks, tried with a desperation that made her hate herself. Even as she could not stop, she would position herself in the drawing room when she knew he would pass through. They would comment on estate matters she had overheard the housekeeper discussing, would ask after his day when they happened to cross paths in the portrait gallery, her voice too bright, too eager, and his responses were always the same. Brief, polite, utterly devoid of genuine engagement, monosyllables delivered without meeting her eyes, answers that were technically civil, but carried the unmistakable message that her words were an intrusion, her presence an inconvenience, her very existence something to be endured rather than acknowledged. The weight of being unseen pressed upon her with increasing force, a physical heaviness that settled in her chest and made breathing difficult, made rising each morning an act of will, made her question everything she had once believed about herself, her worth, her intelligence, her capacity to be loved, until the reflection she saw in mirrors became a stranger, a woman whose eyes held a growing emptiness that terrified her, a duchess in name who had become a ghost in truth, invisible even to herself. In the deepest hours of night, when sleep eluded her and the manor lay silent, save for the settling of ancient timbers and the whisper of wind against leaded windows, Eleanor would retreat into the landscape of memory, seeking refuge in a past that seemed increasingly unreal, a life before Ashworth Manor that belonged to a different woman. Entirely she remembered her family home, Hartley House, with its comfortable shabbiness and warm chaos, her mother's laughter echoing through drawing rooms that smelled of beeswax and roses, in her father's study, where he had taught her Greek and Latin despite her governess's protestations that such learning was wasted on a girl, the library where she had devoured philosophy and poetry with equal hunger, believing foolishly that a mind well-furnished might be as valuable as a face well-favored, that intelligence and curiosity were qualities a husband might treasure rather than tolerate. She had imagined marriage as a partnership of minds and hearts, had dreamed in her girlish naivete of conversations that stretched into dawn, of shared books and debated ideas, and of a companion who might see her not as ornament or broodmare, but as a complete person worthy of genuine regard and the reality of her situation. This beautiful prison, this marriage that was no marriage at all, this existence as furniture in her own life, constituted a betrayal not just of those dreams, but of everything she had believed herself to be. Reading had become both escape and torment. She would lose herself in novels where heroines were loved and valued, where misunderstandings were resolved and hearts were won, and then she would surface back into her own story, this narrative, without arc or resolution, and the contrast would leave her hollow, aching with a grief that had no proper outlet because what she mourned had never actually existed, only the possibility of what might have been. The rose garden in its winter desolation had become the repository of her private sorrow, the one place she allowed herself the luxury of tears, and she would stand among the frozen bushes, her breath clouding in frigid air, and weep silently for the girl she had been, for the woman she was becoming, this hollow creature, this shadow self, this duchess without substance, and the tears would freeze on her cheeks like diamonds, beautiful and cold and utterly meaningless. She began having conversations with herself, internal dialogues that grew increasingly desperate. Asterisk. What is wrong with me? Am I truly so unworthy of basic human acknowledgement? Did I commit some sin in a previous life that this is my penance? Asterisk. And the questions would spiral darker. Asterisk. Perhaps I am genuinely uninteresting. Perhaps my education was pretension. Perhaps I deserve this silence because I am fundamentally undeserving of anything else. Asterisk hope. That fragile thing she had protected so carefully through the early weeks, it began to erode like coastline beneath relentless waves. Each ignored greeting and deflected conversation, wearing away another piece, until she could feel its structure weakening, could sense the approaching moment when it would collapse entirely. And somewhere in the cold February darkness, standing once more in the rose garden with tears freezing on her face, Eleanor arrived at a realization that felt simultaneously like surrender and liberation. Asterisk. I cannot continue seeking validation from someone who has chosen not to see me. I cannot pour myself endlessly into this void. I must stop trying, must turn away, must find some other purpose, or I will disappear completely, will become the ghost he already believes me to be. Asterisk. The decision formed slowly, painfully, like ice crystallizing. She would stop reaching, stop hoping, stop waiting for Sebastian to acknowledge her existence, and instead, she would build a life of her own, whatever that might mean, however lonely it might be, because even solitude chosen was preferable to this endless, grinding erasure of self. The weeks that followed Eleanor's decision moved with the strange quality of a fever breaking, the world coming back into focus with painful clarity, and she began to observe Sebastian, not with the desperate hope of earlier months, but with the cool detachment of a naturalist, studying an exotic and dangerous creature from a safe distance. She watched him stride across the estate grounds, in deep conversation with his steward, noting the way he listened intently to concerns about tenant cottages needing repair, how he authorized expenditures without hesitation when they involved the welfare of those dependent upon him, and she saw him in the stables, speaking gently to a groom's young son who had been kicked by a horse, his hand steady and kind on the boy's shoulder, his voice low with genuine concern. And these observations accumulated like evidence in a trial, painting a portrait of a man who was not cruel, not heartless, but deeply, profoundly isolated, a man who had built walls so high and thick that perhaps he could no longer see over them himself, could no longer remember what it meant to let another soul pass through the fortifications. She understood, with a clarity that brought neither comfort nor absolution, that Sebastian's treatment of her was not personal cruelty, but rather a kind of self-preservation, that whatever wounds he carried had taught him that distance was safety, that invisibility was a gift. He offered them both, sparing them the messy complications of actual human connection, and this understanding shifted something fundamental in Eleanor's relationship to her own suffering. It was not about her worthiness after all, not about some failing in her character or person, but about his incapacity, his damage, his choice to live half a life rather than risk the full catastrophe of feeling. The realization liberated her in ways she had not anticipated, lifting the weight of self-blame that had been crushing her beneath its impossible burden, and in the space that opened up, a new determination took root. She would not wait for Sebastian to see her, would not sacrifice herself on the altar of his emotional unavailability, would instead turn her attention outward, toward a world that extended far beyond the cold walls of Ashworth Manor. The invitations had continued to arrive throughout her months of invisible suffering, delivered on silver trays by footmen who had watched her decline them with increasing melancholy, cards requesting her presence at musicales and dinner parties and country dances, the local society eager to welcome their new duchess into the intricate social fabric of the county, and Eleanor had refused them all, telling herself that her place was here, that a wife's duty was to remain available to her husband, even when he wanted nothing to do with her. But now she retrieved the latest batch from the secretary in her sitting room and read them with new eyes, seeing not obligations but possibilities, not burdens but escapes. She penned her acceptances with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the unfamiliar sensation of choosing something for herself, of asserting her own existence, independent of Sebastian's acknowledgement or lack thereof. And when she sealed the letters with wax bearing the Ashworth crest, she felt the first stirrings of something she had not experienced in months, something that might, given time and cultivation, grow into hope again. Though this time a hope directed not toward her marriage but toward her own survival, her own becoming, her own life. The first musicale Eleanor attended was held at Pembroke Hall, a gracious manor house some 5 miles from Ashworth, and she arrived with her heart beating against her ribs like a caged bird, testing the strength of its bars, uncertain whether she was flying toward freedom or merely a different form of confinement. But the moment she stepped into the drawing room with its walls covered in silk damask and its air perfumed with hothouse flowers and beeswax candles, she felt something shift inside her chest, some tightness, loosening just enough to draw a full breath for the first time in months. Lady Catherine Pembroke, a woman of perhaps 40 with intelligent eyes and a warm smile that reached those eyes in a way that spoke of genuine feeling rather than social performance, swept forward to greet her with unaffected pleasure, taking Eleanor's hands in hers and saying, "My dear Duchess, we are absolutely delighted. You've come. I had quite despaired of ever properly making your acquaintance, and I confess I have been longing to know you better. For anyone who chooses Plutarch over the latest Gothic novels must be a woman of substance." And Eleanor felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, because here was someone who had noticed her, who had paid attention to what she read during those long afternoons in the Manor's library, who saw her as more than merely the newest Duchess of Ashworth. The evening unfolded like a flower opening to sunlight, each moment revealing something Eleanor had forgotten. She possessed the ability to converse intelligently about music and literature, to laugh at witty observations, and to offer her own thoughts and have them received with interest rather than indifference or silence. And when Lady Catherine mentioned that their hostess, Mrs. Alderton, was in desperate need of someone to play Haydn on the pianoforte, as her regular performer had taken ill, Eleanor found herself volunteering before fear could silence her, and then she was seated at the instrument, her fingers finding the keys with a sureness she had not felt in her own body for so long, and the music poured out of her like water from a broken dam, months of suppressed feeling channeled into something beautiful and ordered and heard. The applause that followed was genuine, enthusiastic, and Eleanor felt herself bloom under its warmth, like those roses in the hothouse that Sebastian tended with more care than he had ever shown his wife, though she pushed that bitter thought away, determined not to let Sebastian's ghost haunt even this moment of small triumph. Lady Catherine claimed her afterward, introducing her to the other ladies present, and Eleanor discovered that conversation could be pleasure rather than ordeal, that her opinions on poetry and philosophy and the proper education of young women were not tedious or unwelcome, but rather sparked animated discussion, and by the time she returned to Ashworth Manor well past midnight, her cheeks hurt from smiling and her spirit felt lighter than it had since her wedding day. Sebastian was not at dinner the following evening, had not been present when she returned flushed and happy from Pembroke Hall, and Eleanor discovered, with something approaching wonder, that his absence no longer felt like abandonment, but rather like liberation, like space in which she might finally expand into herself, and she ate her solitary meal with something that might, given time and cultivation, grow into contentment. Autumn arrived at Ashworth Manor with its customary ceremony of gold and crimson, the trees surrendering their leaves to the wind like courtiers bowing before royalty, and Eleanor discovered that she had somehow, without conscious intention, surrendered her unhappiness, along with the summer, letting it fall away like those leaves to reveal something stronger and more enduring beneath a woman who had learned to bloom in soil that provided no nourishment, who had found her own light when none was offered. The transformation was not one of appearance, for Eleanor had always been lovely in her quiet way, but rather a metamorphosis of spirit that the servants noticed first, remarking among themselves how the Duchess now moved through the halls with purpose rather than that terrible ghostly drift of the early months, how her voice when she spoke to them carried warmth and authority rather than the apologetic hesitance of one who expected to be dismissed. She had organized a charity event for the village, a harvest festival to benefit the families whose cottages Sebastian had authorized for repair months ago, and Eleanor threw herself into the planning with an energy that surprised even her, coordinating with the housekeeper and the vicar and the local merchants, her correspondence growing voluminous as her days filled with delightful purpose, and she laughed again, truly laughed when the baker's wife made a jest about the impossibility of teaching Lord Hartley's hounds not to steal the cakes meant for the festival, the sound of her own laughter so unfamiliar that it startled her for a moment before she let herself sink into the pure pleasure of it. The servants adored her now, these people who had watched her suffer in invisible silence for so long, and they responded to her requests with an eagerness that spoke of genuine affection rather than mere duty. The maids bringing her tea without being asked, the footmen appearing precisely when she needed assistance with some task, the housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, consulting her on household matters with a respect that acknowledged Eleanor as the true mistress of Ashworth rather than merely a decorative addition to its inventory. Sebastian watched her from the windows of his study, though Eleanor remained unaware of his observation, and he saw her working in the gardens with Lady Catherine and the vicar's wife, arranging autumn flowers for the festival decorations, her face lit with genuine pleasure as she laughed at something Catherine said, her hands moving with confident grace among the bronze chrysanthemums and the late-blooming roses, and something tightened in his chest that he did not recognize, something that felt almost like pain but sharper, more insistent, a sensation he could not name because he had spent so many years avoiding anything that resembled feeling. He told himself it was satisfaction that his Duchess had finally settled into her role, that she was fulfilling her duties to the estate and the community, nothing more. But the tightness in his chest did not ease when he turned away from the window, and late that night, alone in his chambers with a book he could not seem to focus on, Sebastian found himself wondering when Eleanor had stopped seeking him out, when she had stopped appearing at breakfast with that terrible hope in her eyes, when she had transformed from the anxious girl who had arrived at Ashworth into this woman who smiled in the gardens and needed nothing from him at all. Lord James Whitmore arrived at Ashworth Manor on a crisp October afternoon, when the light slanted golden through the windows and the air carried that peculiar clarity that autumn brings, like the world sharpening into focus after summer's haze, and Eleanor was in the morning room reviewing correspondence for the harvest festival when Hobbs announced the visitor with a formality that suggested the caller was someone of significance, though Eleanor could not imagine who might be calling specifically for her rather than for the Duke. When James entered the room, it took her a moment to recognize him, for the gangling boy she had known in her childhood had transformed into a man of perhaps 30 with warm brown eyes and an open, honest face that broke immediately into a smile of such genuine pleasure that Eleanor felt something in her chest unfold, like a flower that had been closed too long against cold wind, and she rose without thinking, her own face mirroring his delight, as she said his name like a question and an answer both. They had been children together in Hampshire, their estates neighboring, and James had been the boy who taught her to climb trees and catch frogs, and argue about philosophy with a seriousness that was absurd in children of 10, but which had formed the foundation of Eleanor's intellectual confidence. And now here he stood in her drawing room, substantial and real, looking at her with eyes that actually saw her, that recognized not the Duchess of Ashworth but Eleanor herself, the person she had been before she became invisible. Their conversation flowed like water, finding its natural course, easy and unforced, filled with shared memories of muddy adventures and stolen books, and the time they had convinced themselves they could learn Latin in a fortnight, if only they applied sufficient determination, and Eleanor laughed until her sides ached, the sound filling the morning room with a warmth it had never known. And James told her about his travels to Italy and Greece, about the art and architecture and philosophy he had studied, and he asked her questions about her own reading and thoughts in a way that suggested he genuinely cared about her answers, that her mind was not merely decorative but valuable, interesting, worth engaging. It was in this scene of warmth and laughter that Sebastian appeared, drawn by the unfamiliar sound of Eleanor's unbridled joy, echoing through halls that had known only silence from her for months, and he stood in the doorway observing the tableau before him, his wife's face alight with pleasure, her hands gesturing animatedly as she spoke, a handsome man leaning toward her with obvious appreciation and interest, and something cold and sharp twisted in Sebastian's chest, like a blade finding the space between his ribs. Eleanor noticed him finally, and rose, performing the introductions with perfect courtesy, her voice steady as she explained that Lord Whitmore was an old friend from Hampshire, and Sebastian executed the requisite pleasantries with the icy formality he had perfected over years of social armor, noting with displeasure how Whitmore's eyes kept returning to Eleanor's face as though drawn by magnetism, how the man smiled at her with an ease and familiarity that Sebastian had never attempted, and had never wanted, had never permitted himself. And after barely 5 minutes of strained conversation, Sebastian excused himself with a coldness that bordered on rudeness, leaving Eleanor and Whitmore to their reunion, retreating to his study, where he poured himself brandy, though it was barely past noon, and told himself the dark feeling churning in his gut was merely surprise at the unexpected visitor, and nothing more, certainly nothing that resembled the poison of jealousy, for one could not be jealous over something one had never wanted in the first place. Lord Whitmore called again 3 days later, and this time he came with an invitation that he extended to Eleanor in the drawing-room where autumn light pooled across the carpet like spilled honey, asking if she might do him the honor of attending the county assembly ball as his guest, for he had been informed by Lady Catherine that the Duchess had attended several local events, and he thought perhaps she might enjoy the dancing, and Eleanor felt her heart lift at the prospect, not because of James himself, though his company was undeniably pleasant, but because the invitation represented something larger, a life that existed beyond the walls of Ashworth Manor, beyond the cold silences and careful invisibility she had endured for so long, a life where she was wanted and seen and valued. She accepted without hesitation, without the impulse to seek Sebastian's permission or even inform him of her plans, for she had learned in these months of building her own existence that she need not ask permission to live. And it was only by chance that Sebastian overheard the exchange as he passed the drawing-room on his way to his study, Whitmore's warm voice carrying through the partially open door as he expressed his delight at Eleanor's acceptance, promising to call for her at 8, and Sebastian felt something hot and sharp twist beneath his ribs, an irritation he could not name, could not justify, for what did it matter to him if his wife attended a country assembly with an old friend, when he himself had shown no interest in her society, no desire for her company, no acknowledgement of her existence beyond the barest requirements of civility. The night of the ball arrived with unseasonable warmth, as though autumn itself had decided to grant one final gift before surrendering to winter's advance, and Eleanor prepared for the evening with a care she had not taken since her wedding day, choosing a gown of rose-colored silk that brought color to her cheeks and made her dark eyes luminous, her maid arranging her hair in an elegant style that framed her face softly, and when she descended the stairs to where James waited in the entrance hall, she looked radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the gown or the jewels at her throat, and everything to do with the light of anticipated pleasure in her expression, the confidence of a woman who had learned her own worth. Sebastian attended the assembly that evening, a decision that surprised even him, for he typically avoided such provincial entertainments, telling himself it was merely his duty as the Duke to show his face at significant county events, that his attendance had nothing whatsoever to do with Eleanor or Whitmore, or the inexplicable restlessness that had plagued him since overhearing that invitation. But he knew, even as he formulated these justifications, that they were lies, knew that he came because he could not bear not to, because something in him needed to see Eleanor in that rose-colored gown, and needed to witness what he had so carefully avoided, witnessing for months, his wife alive and present and real in the world beyond his deliberate blindness. He positioned himself at the edge of the ballroom, where he could observe without being observed, his posture rigid with ducal composure, even as his eyes tracked Eleanor's movements through the crowd, watching as she greeted acquaintances with genuine warmth, as she laughed at something, Lady Catherine whispered, as she accepted a glass of champagne from Whitmore, with a smile that made something in Sebastian's chest constrict painfully, and he stood there in the shadows of the assembly room, like a ghost haunting the edges of a life he had refused to live, unable to look away from the woman he had treated as invisible for so long, the woman who had somehow learned to shine without him. The orchestra struck the opening notes of the waltz, and Sebastian watched from his position against the far wall as Lord Whitmore extended his hand to Eleanor with a smile that was warm and confident, and utterly without the hesitation that had characterized Sebastian's every interaction with her. And when she placed her gloved hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the floor, Sebastian felt his jaw tighten involuntarily, his fingers curling around the glass of champagne he held with enough force that he briefly feared it might shatter. The waltz began, and what Sebastian witnessed in those minutes felt like watching a curtain pull back on a stage to reveal a performance he had never known was possible. For the woman who moved in, Lord Whitmore's arms bore no resemblance to the silent, careful Duchess who had haunted the edges of Ashworth Manor for months. Her steps tentative, her voice soft, her presence so deliberately unobtrusive that Sebastian had found it easy, shamefully, damnably easy to pretend she did not exist at all. This Eleanor was radiant, her face alight with pleasure as Whitmore guided her through the turns, her rose-colored gown swirling around her ankles like rose petals caught in wind, and she was laughing at something. Whitmore said, the sound carrying across the ballroom clear and genuine, and utterly devastating to Sebastian, who realized with a shock that felt physical that he had never heard her laugh like that, had never seen her face unguarded and joyful, had never witnessed the grace with which she moved when she was not trying to make herself small and invisible to avoid disturbing his carefully maintained distance. Whitmore held her with the practiced ease of a man who had danced with many women and knew exactly how to make each one feel treasured. His hand at her waist, respectful yet somehow intimate, his eyes never leaving her face, and he spoke to her throughout the dance, drawing forth more of that luminous laughter, more of that unguarded joy, and Sebastian could not look away, even though every moment of watching felt like a blade sliding between his ribs. He could not move from his position against the wall, even though everything in him wanted to stride across that floor and claim what was his by marriage, if not by any earned right. The waltz seemed to last an eternity, and no time at all, the music swelling and falling like waves against shore, and Sebastian watched as Whitmore spun Eleanor through a turn, and she tilted her head back with pure delight, watched as they moved together in perfect synchrony, as though they had danced together 1,000 times before, and something in Sebastian's chest, shattered like ice that had been frozen solid for years, suddenly struck by stone, not a clean break, but a splintering, a fracturing that spread outward in cracks he could feel radiating through his entire being. This was jealousy, he recognized with dawning horror, this sick burning in his gut, this inability to breathe properly, this overwhelming desire to separate Eleanor from Whitmore's arms and never let another man touch her, look at her, make her laugh like that. And with the jealousy came something worse, something that made him grip the champagne glass so tightly he heard it crack. The devastating recognition that he had done this to himself, had chosen this isolation, had actively refused to see the woman who was legally his wife, had treated her with such deliberate indifference that she had built a life entirely separate from him, a life where she bloomed and laughed and danced in another man's arms, while Sebastian stood in shadows, watching what he had, willfully, stupidly, catastrophically ignored. Sebastian left the assembly before the waltz had even ended, striding from the ballroom with a control that was purely external, for inside he felt something collapsing like a structure whose foundations had been secretly rotting for years, finally giving way under weight it could no longer bear, and he called for his carriage with a voice that sounded remarkably steady, considering the chaos rioting through his chest. Rode back to Ashworth Manor through darkness that felt appropriate to his mood, let himself into the silent house, where servants had long since retired, and made his way to his study like a wounded animal seeking its den. He poured brandy with hands that trembled slightly, drank it in one swallow that burned down his throat, poured another, and carried it to the window where he stood, staring out at grounds rendered colorless by moonlight, and the image of Eleanor in Whitmore's arms replayed behind his eyes with merciless clarity. Her laughter, her grace, the way she had glowed with an aliveness he had never seen in all their months of marriage, an aliveness he had never thought to evoke or even acknowledge. The brandy did nothing to quiet the tumult in his mind, and Sebastian found himself sinking into the leather chair behind his desk, the glass cradled in both hands, memories flooding back with the force of a dam breaking, memories he had kept carefully locked away for 3 years, memories of Catherine, his first wife, beautiful and charming and utterly faithless, the woman he had loved with the wholehearted devotion of a young man who had not yet learned that love could be weaponized, who had not yet discovered that trust could be shattered beyond repair. He had found her in the conservatory with his closest friend, had watched through the glass as she laughed in another man's arms much as Eleanor had laughed tonight, and the betrayal had been so complete, so devastating, that Sebastian had vowed in the wreckage of that discovery to never risk his heart again, to never allow another woman close enough to wound him, to build walls so high and thick that nothing could penetrate them. When Catherine died in a carriage accident 6 months later, Sebastian had grieved not for the loss of her but for the loss of the man he had been before her betrayal, the man who had believed in love and loyalty and the possibility of happiness, and he had hardened himself deliberately, carefully, transforming into the cold duke that society whispered about, the man who kept everyone at a distance, who found safety in isolation. The marriage to Eleanor had been arranged by their families with an understanding that suited Sebastian perfectly, a union of convenience, of duty, requiring nothing more than his name and his protection, no expectations of affection or intimacy or connection, and he had approached it with relief, believing he had found the perfect solution, a wife who would fulfill the requirements of his position without threatening the fortress he had built around what remained of his heart. But Eleanor was never supposed to become real, was never supposed to be anything more than a shadow moving through his house, a name on documents, and a figure at the far end of the dinner table, on the rare occasions when duty required them to dine together. And Sebastian realized now with sickening clarity that he had chosen not to see her, had actively refused to acknowledge her presence, her attempts at conversation, her gentle overtures, because seeing her would have made her real, would have made her a person rather than an arrangement, would have put his carefully constructed defenses at risk. He had treated her with deliberate indifference, had turned away from every attempt she made to reach him, and he had told himself it was kindness, that he was protecting her from inevitable disappointment, but he understood now that it had been cruelty of the worst kind, the cruelty of erasure, of making another human being feel invisible and worthless and alone. Sebastian remained in his study through the small hours of morning, watching from his window as Eleanor's carriage finally returned to Ashworth Manor near midnight, and even from this distance he could see the lightness in her step as she descended, could observe the way she paused to look up at the stars with a smile still playing about her lips, and the sight of her happiness, happiness that had nothing whatsoever to do with him, twisted something in his chest that felt remarkably like grief. He did not sleep, and when dawn came pale and cold through the window, he found himself making a decision that would have been unthinkable mere hours before, bathing and dressing with more care than usual, making his way down to the breakfast room at the precise hour when he knew Eleanor took her morning meal, a room he had avoided for months in favor of having trays sent to his study. When he entered, Eleanor was already seated with her tea and toast, a book propped open beside her plate in the manner of someone accustomed to dining alone, and the look of pure shock that crossed her face when she glanced up and saw him standing in the doorway would have been amusing under different circumstances, her eyes widening, her hand freezing halfway to her cup, her entire body tensing as though preparing for some unpleasant revelation. Sebastian cleared his throat, suddenly uncertain how to occupy space in a room where he had made himself a stranger, and moved to the sideboard with what he hoped appeared to be casual purpose, serving himself coffee with hands that felt awkward and clumsy, taking the seat at the head of the table that placed him closer to her than they had been in months, near enough to see the faint shadows beneath her eyes that suggested she had slept as poorly as he. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, weighted and uncomfortable, and Sebastian searched for words that had once come easily in society, but now felt foreign on his tongue, settling finally on, "You returned late last evening," which sounded even to his own ears less like polite observation and more like accusation, and he watched Eleanor's expression shutter closed, her shoulders straightening with a dignity that made him feel suddenly small. "The assembly was quite pleasant," she replied with perfect courtesy, her voice level and distant, the voice she might use with any casual acquaintance, and she returned her attention to her book with a deliberateness that suggested the conversation was concluded, and Sebastian felt the sharp sting of dismissal, recognized it because he had perfected the art himself over these long months. He tried again, asking after her plans for the day, commenting on the unseasonably mild weather, mentioning some piece of estate business that he thought might interest her, and to each inquiry, Eleanor responded with flawless politeness, her answers complete enough to satisfy social convention, but offering nothing of herself, no invitation to further discourse, no warmth, no indication that she welcomed his sudden presence at her table, and Sebastian understood with dawning horror that he was experiencing precisely what he had inflicted upon her since their wedding day. The careful courtesy that was somehow worse than open hostility, the acknowledgement without engagement, the treatment of another human being as an obligation rather than a person. When Eleanor finished her tea and rose to leave, murmuring something about correspondence that required her attention, Sebastian remained seated and watched her go, and the realization settled over him like cold water that she had stopped reaching for him entirely, had built walls as impenetrable as his own, and he had no idea how to breach them. The following days brought a transformation in the rhythms of Ashworth Manor that did not go unnoticed by the household staff, for Sebastian began appearing in spaces he had long avoided, as materializing at breakfast each morning, with a determination that would have been admirable had it not been so transparently desperate. And Mrs. Hartwig, the housekeeper, exchanged meaningful glances with Burton the butler as they observed their master's clumsy attempts to engage a duchess who had learned the art of polite distance from a master. Sebastian would inquire about Eleanor's plans for the day over morning tea, commenting on the weather or some bit of estate news with the stilted formality of a man who had forgotten how to converse with his own wife, and Eleanor would respond with perfect courtesy that revealed nothing, her answers complete enough to satisfy propriety, but offering no foothold for deeper connection, and Sebastian found himself floundering in waters he had once navigated with ease before he had deliberately abandoned such navigation altogether. He began attending the very social events he had avoided for years, appearing at afternoon teas and musicales where he knew Eleanor would be present, standing at the periphery of gatherings, with his ducal composure intact while his eyes followed her movements across rooms, watching as she laughed with Lady Catherine Pembroke as she discussed her charity plans with the vicar's wife, as she existed in a world she had built entirely without him, and the ache in his chest grew sharper with each observation. When Eleanor mentioned in passing at breakfast that she was organizing a fundraising event for the village school, Sebastian immediately offered the manor's ballroom, offered his financial support, offered himself in whatever capacity might be useful, and the flicker of surprise in her eyes was gratifying until it was replaced by that same careful courtesy that cut deeper than any rebuke, her thanks genuine but measured, her acceptance of his offer framed as appreciation for his generosity to the village rather than to her. Lord Whitmore continued to call with a regularity that made Sebastian's jaw tighten, though he could find no reasonable objection, for Whitmore was unfailingly proper in his conduct, always requesting to see the Duchess in public rooms, always departing at appropriate hours, and yet Sebastian would find himself inventing reasons to pass by the drawing-room when Whitmore was present, would hear through closed doors the sound of Eleanor's laughter, that same bright, genuine laughter he had witnessed at the assembly, and the knowledge that another man could evoke such joy when he himself had only ever produced polite smiles felt like acid in his veins. The servants observed everything with the keen awareness of those whose livelihoods depend on understanding the dynamics of their employers, and Cook mentioned to Mrs. Hartwick how His Grace had actually asked what dishes the Duchess preferred, and the footman Thomas reported that the Duke had been seen lingering in doorways as though uncertain of his welcome in his own home, and there was a collective hope among the staff that perhaps their master was finally waking to what he had, though Mrs. Hartwick cautioned that waking was one matter and being forgiven quite another, for she had seen the loneliness in their young Duchess's eyes these many months, and knew that wounds of neglect did not heal simply because the one who inflicted them had belatedly recognized their existence. The rain came on a Thursday afternoon, in sheets that blurred the windows of Ashworth Manor and turned the world beyond into watercolor impressions, and Sebastian found Eleanor in the library where she had taken to spending her afternoons, curled in the window seat with a volume of poetry that she appeared absorbed in, though he suspected from the stillness of her hands that she had not turned a page in some minutes. He entered quietly, his boots silent on the thick carpet, and cleared his throat to announce his presence, watching as she glanced up with that now familiar expression of polite inquiry that held no warmth, no welcome, merely acknowledgement of his existence in shared space. "I wondered if we might talk," he said, hating the uncertain quality in his own voice, and she gestured to a chair with perfect courtesy, saying that of course he was welcome in his own library, but she did not set aside her book, did not shift her position to better face him, and Sebastian felt his carefully maintained composure begin to fray at the edges. He attempted conversation about the rain, about estate matters, about her upcoming charity event, and she responded to each with appropriate but minimal answers before returning her gaze to her book, and the dismissal in the gesture was so practiced, so perfectly mirrored from his own behavior these many months, that something in Sebastian's chest finally cracked open. "You've changed," he said, the words emerging with more force than he intended, and Eleanor looked up slowly, her expression unreadable, one eyebrow lifting in silent question that somehow felt like condemnation. "No, Your Grace," she replied with devastating gentleness, setting her book aside at last, but maintaining her position by the window as though the physical distance between them was necessary for what she needed to say. "I simply stopped waiting to be noticed." The words landed like physical blows, each one finding its mark with precision, and Sebastian felt his face grow hot with shame and something darker, something that tasted of desperation and loss. He tried to explain then, stumbling over words about his first wife's betrayal, about the wounds that had never properly healed, about his decision to protect himself by keeping Eleanor at distance, and she listened with an expression that might have been compassion, but was more likely pity, and when he finished his halting explanation, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Your pain does not excuse my erasure," Eleanor said, and her voice remained gentle but carried an edge of steel that he had never heard before, had never known she possessed, because he had never bothered to truly know her at all. "I understand that you were hurt, Sebastian. I may call you Sebastian in private conversation, mayn't I, since we are married? But your choice to protect yourself meant choosing to make me invisible, and I will not accept that my worth as a human being should be sacrificed to ease your fears." She stood then, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly, though her voice remained steady, and Sebastian found himself rising as well, reaching toward her though he had no right, watching as she stepped back from his outstretched hand with a grace that somehow made the rejection absolute. The evening had settled into that particular stillness that comes after dinner, when the manor holds its breath between day and night, and Eleanor sat in her private sitting room with embroidery she had no real interest in completing, her needle moving through fabric with mechanical precision, while her mind wandered through the labyrinth of her conversation with Sebastian that afternoon, when a soft knock at her door pulled her from her reverie with a start, because no one disturbed her in these evening hours, not even her lady's maid unless summoned. She called permission to enter, expecting perhaps Mrs. Hartwick with some household matter, but instead Sebastian appeared in the doorway, and the sight of him there, in this space that had become her sanctuary, was so unprecedented that Eleanor found herself setting aside her embroidery with hands that trembled slightly, her heart beginning a nervous rhythm against her ribs. "Might I come in?" he asked, and there was something in his voice she had never heard before, a vulnerability that stripped away the ducal authority and left only a man uncertain of his welcome, and Eleanor gestured to the chair opposite hers, watching as he entered and closed the door behind him with careful attention to propriety, leaving it open just enough that their conversation could not be called improper, but closed enough that they might speak without being overheard. He sat as though the chair might collapse beneath him, his tall frame somehow diminished by the same uncertainty that colored his voice, and for a long moment he simply looked at his hands, those elegant aristocratic hands that had never reached for her in tenderness, and Eleanor waited in the heavy silence because she had learned patience in these months of invisibility and would not break it now simply to ease his discomfort. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking under pressure it was never meant to withstand, and he told her everything about his first wife, Margaret, about their courtship that had seemed like a love match, about the year of marriage that had appeared happy to the outside world, while Margaret conducted an affair with his closest friend, about discovering them together in circumstances that had shattered not just his marriage, but his fundamental belief in his own judgment. He spoke of the divorce that had scandalized society, of the self-imposed isolation that followed, of his vow never to allow another person close enough to wound him so deeply, and Eleanor listened without interruption, watching his face as he laid bare the pain he had carried for 5 years, like a stone in his chest. Understanding for the first time the walls he had built were not casual cruelty, but desperate self-preservation. When our families arranged this marriage, Sebastian continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, I told myself it was perfect, precisely because it meant nothing, because you were a stranger who would remain a stranger, because I could fulfill my duty to produce an heir without risking my heart. He finally looked up at her then, his eyes dark with anguish and honesty that made her breath catch, and she saw tears there that he did not try to hide. This proud duke, who had maintained his composure through every social event and business dealing, now trembling before her with the rawness of his confession. But you were never meant to become real, Eleanor. You were never meant to laugh or to bloom or to fill the manor with music and purpose. And I realized too late that I chose not to see you, because seeing you made you dangerous, made you someone who could hurt me if I allowed myself to care. And so I made you invisible rather than risk discovering that you mattered. Eleanor sat very still in her chair as Sebastian's confession hung in the air between them like morning mist, and she felt the weight of his words settling into her bones, understanding for the first time the architecture of his cruelty, though understanding did not equal forgiveness, did not erase the months she had spent as a ghost in her own life, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap, where he could not see them. I thank you for your honesty, Sebastian, she began, watching his face as she used his given name again, claiming the small intimacy as her right after what he had shared. And I do understand the pain that drove you to build such formidable walls. I understand it in the way one understands a language learned from books rather than lived experience, intellectually rather than viscerally, but I understand nonetheless. She paused, gathering her thoughts like flowers from a garden, choosing each one with care, because what she said now mattered more than perhaps anything she had ever said in her life. What I need you to understand in return is that for those months when you chose not to see me, I was drowning in a loneliness so profound that some mornings I could scarcely find the will to rise from my bed, and I would stand before my mirror and wonder what deficiency in myself made me so thoroughly unworthy of even basic acknowledgement from the man who had vowed before God to cherish me. Her voice caught slightly on the last words, and she saw Sebastian flinch as though struck, but she pressed on because he needed to hear this, needed to understand that his protection had come at a cost measured in her pain. I tried, Sebastian, God knows I tried to reach you, to find some crack in your armor where I might slip through, and each time you met my attempts with polite distance, it carved away another piece of my sense of worth until I began to believe that perhaps I truly was as invisible as you made me feel. She stood then, moving to the window where rain still streaked the glass, her back to him because some truths were easier spoken without the weight of his gaze upon her. I spent weeks in the rose garden crying into my hands where no one could hear, questioning everything about myself, wondering if I was too plain or too dull or too earnest, constructing elaborate explanations for why you could not bear to look at me, and the conclusion I finally reached was that I deserved more than existing as a shadow in my own marriage. Eleanor turned back to face him, and in her eyes was a sadness that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with acceptance of painful truth. "I understand your pain. Truly I do, but I cannot sacrifice myself to it. I cannot allow your past wounds to define my future, and somewhere in those invisible months, I stopped hoping that you would see me, stopped waiting for acknowledgement that never came, and now that you finally offer it, I find that I do not know if I have the courage to hope again, because hoping and being disappointed has nearly destroyed me once already." She moved back to her chair, sitting with the careful dignity she had learned to wear like armor in those months of isolation, and her next words were perhaps the most honest she had ever spoken. I do not know if I can trust you with my heart, Sebastian, when you have already proven that you can live quite contentedly without acknowledging I possess one." The weeks that followed their conversation in Eleanor's sitting room passed with the peculiar quality of watching ice melt in early spring, imperceptible from moment to moment, yet unmistakable in its gradual transformation, and Eleanor found herself navigating a new landscape, where Sebastian's presence had shifted from absent to quietly persistent, without ever becoming demanding, a careful dance of proximity that respected the boundaries she had drawn, while demonstrating a consistency she had never known from him before. The first morning after their honest exchange, she discovered a bouquet of white roses from the hothouse on her breakfast table, the variety she had mentioned loving in passing during one of her early attempts at conversation months ago, a detail she had assumed he had never heard, and there was no note attached because Sebastian seemed to understand that grand declarations would ring hollow where steady action might speak truth. He began appearing at breakfast again, not every morning but often enough that his presence became a tentative pattern rather than a shock, and he would ask about her plans for the day with genuine interest in his eyes, listening when she spoke of her charity work or her correspondence with Lady Catherine, contributing observations that proved he had been paying attention to her life even when she thought herself unobserved, though Eleanor remained cautious in her responses, kind but measured, protecting the fragile peace she had built in her independence. When Eleanor organized a reading afternoon for the village children in the manor's library, Sebastian appeared in the doorway halfway through her reading of fairy tales, leaning against the frame, with his arms crossed, and something almost like wonder on his face as he watched her bring the stories to life with different voices for each character, and afterward he mentioned that he had ordered new books for the library collection, titles she had once expressed interest in reading, in small gestures that accumulated like snowflakes until Eleanor could no longer pretend she did not notice them. Lord Whitmore continued to call, though less frequently as his visit to the county drew toward its conclusion, and Sebastian no longer retreated when the man arrived, but instead joined them for tea, participating in conversation with strained politeness that Eleanor recognized as immense effort from a man who had spent years avoiding such intimacy, and she observed the tension in Sebastian's jaw when Whitmore made her laugh, the careful control he exercised over his expression, and something in her chest that had been frozen solid began to soften despite her determination to remain guarded. Sebastian attended Eleanor's charity events, standing at the periphery and watching her work with the dedication she brought to everything she cared about, and once, when she struggled to lift a crate of donated items, he appeared at her side without a word and carried it for her, their fingers brushing accidentally in the transfer and his sharp intake of breath, telling her the touch had affected him as profoundly as it affected her, though neither acknowledged it aloud. The servants noticed everything, of course, because servants always did, and Mrs. Hartwick began setting two places at dinner more often than one, and Eleanor found herself accepting Sebastian's quiet company in the drawing-room after meals, both of them reading in companionable silence that felt less like avoidance and more like the careful building of something that might eventually become trust. Though Eleanor reminded herself nightly that consistency across weeks did not erase months of erasure, that she must guard her heart even as she felt it straining toward hope despite her better judgment. Winter arrived at Ashworth Manor with the same crystalline silence that had marked Eleanor's first months there. But this time the cold held a different quality, as though the season itself had been transformed by all that had passed between then and now, and on an evening when frost painted delicate patterns across the windows, Eleanor stood in the grand drawing-room, preparing for the musicale she had organized, a gathering of local society that would fill the manor with warmth and music and life in ways that would have been unimaginable during those frozen early months of her marriage. She wore a gown of deep sapphire that brought out the color of her eyes, and her hands were steady as she arranged the final details with Mrs. Hartwick, who beamed at her with unconcealed pride in how their Duchess had transformed not just herself, but the very atmosphere of the estate. And when the guests began to arrive, Eleanor greeted each one with genuine warmth, moving through the rooms with a grace born not of duty but of authentic pleasure in her role as hostess, as the heart of this home she had finally claimed as her own. Sebastian stood near the fireplace watching her navigate the social currents with an ease he had never witnessed in those early months, when she had moved through the manor like a ghost uncertain of her right to occupy space, and something in his chest pulled tight, with mingled pride and regret, pride in who she had become, regret that she'd had to become it without him, that he had missed the transformation because he had been too carefully blind to see it happening. The musicale began with Lady Catherine performing a sonata, followed by the vicar's daughter singing a German art song that brought tears to several eyes, and then Eleanor moved to the pianoforte, with the quiet confidence of someone who had reclaimed something precious that had nearly been lost, settling onto the bench and placing her fingers on the keys with a reverence that made Sebastian's breath catch, because he recognized it as the same reverence he now felt when he allowed himself to truly look at her, to see her as she deserved to be seen. She played Beethoven, the Pathétique sonata that she had practiced alone in empty rooms during those months of invisibility, but now she played it for an audience that listened with rapt attention, and Sebastian found he could not take his eyes from her face, from the way her expression shifted with the music's emotional landscape, and from the complete presence she brought to each note, as though the music was a language she spoke more fluently than words. When the final chord faded into silence, the room erupted in applause, and Eleanor rose and curtsied with flushed cheeks and bright eyes, and as the guests began to disperse for refreshments, Sebastian moved through the thinning crowd toward the pianoforte, where she still stood, his heart hammering against his ribs with a nervousness he had not felt since he was a young man, asking his first dance partner to waltz, and when he reached her, he extended his hand and spoke words that carried the weight of everything unsaid between them. "Might I have the honor of the next dance?" The room had grown quiet, the music ended, but Eleanor understood what he was truly asking, understood that this was an invitation to something far more significant than a simple dance, and after a moment's hesitation that felt like an eternity, she placed her hand in his, and he led her to the center of the empty floor, where they had once stood as strangers, bound by law, but not by choice, and they began to waltz to music only they could hear, the remembered strains of a melody that played in the space between what had been and what might yet be. The waltz ended as silently as it had begun, their movements slowing until they stood perfectly still in the center of the empty drawing room, with their hands still joined and their eyes locked in a gaze that held the weight of every unspoken word from the past months. And Sebastian seemed to understand, without being told, that this moment required more than the public space could contain, that what needed to be said between them deserved privacy and moonlight, and the kind of honesty that could only be spoken in shadows. He led her through the manor's corridors as the last guests departed and the servants discreetly withdrew, their footsteps echoing on marble floors until they reached the conservatory, where frost painted silver patterns on the glass walls, and winter stars gleamed like diamonds scattered across black velvet, and Eleanor felt her breath catch, because this was the room where she had spent so many lonely afternoons, tending roses and pretending she was not weeping, the room where she had taught herself to bloom in solitude because no one was watching her grow. Sebastian turned to face her in the pale moonlight that transformed everything it touched into something ethereal and fragile, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the ducal composure she had grown accustomed to, but instead trembled with raw emotion that made him seem younger, more vulnerable, more human than she had ever witnessed. "I see you, Eleanor," he said, and the words were simple, but they landed in her chest like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she knew about this moment, about him, about what might be possible between two people who had existed as strangers for so long. "Forgive me that it took so long, that I was so lost in my own fear, that I made you invisible, that I treated the gift of your presence in my life as though it were nothing when it was everything I needed, without knowing I needed it." His hands trembled as he reached for hers, and she let him take them because something in his eyes told her this was costing him every ounce of courage he possessed. Forgive me that I had to watch another man look at you the way you deserve to be seen from the first day, that it took jealousy to break through walls I should never have built, and that you suffered months of loneliness because I was too much a coward to risk my heart again after it had been broken before. Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes, not the bitter tears she had cried alone in this very room, but something different, something that felt almost like relief, like the breaking of a fever, like the first thaw after endless winter. I cannot undo those months, Sebastian continued, his own eyes gleaming with moisture that caught the moonlight. I cannot give you back the time I stole from us both, cannot erase the pain of feeling unseen in your own home. But if you'll allow me, Eleanor, if you can find it in your heart to give me the chance I do not deserve, I will spend the rest of our lives ensuring you never feel invisible again, and that you are seen and cherished and loved the way you should have been from the moment you became my wife. The word love hung in the air between them like a promise, and Eleanor felt something break open in her chest, all the careful protection she had built around her heart, crumbling in the face of his raw honesty, and she stepped forward into his arms as tears spilled down both their faces and whispered against his chest that yes, she would allow him to try, that she had been waiting without knowing she was waiting for precisely this moment when he finally became real to her and she to him, and their embrace in the moonlit conservatory felt like the true beginning of their marriage, the one they should have had all along, earned not through arrangement, but through the painful, honest work of two people choosing to be vulnerable enough to truly see each other. 5 years had passed since that moonlit night in the conservatory, when two people who had been strangers finally became husband and wife in truth, and Ashworth Manor had transformed so completely that visitors who remembered its cold formality could scarcely recognize it now, filled as it was with the sound of children's laughter echoing through corridors that had once known only silence, with music drifting from the drawing room where Eleanor played for their daughters who danced with unself-conscious joy, with roses blooming in every season, because Sebastian had expanded the conservatory and hired additional gardeners specifically to ensure his wife never lacked for the flowers she loved. The library where Eleanor had once read alone to escape her loneliness now held 2 worn chairs, positioned side by side before the fireplace, and most evenings found them there together, Sebastian reading estate reports while Eleanor worked on her correspondence or lost herself in poetry, their hands often finding each other across the small space between the chairs in gestures so habitual they barely noticed them anymore. Their eldest daughter, Catherine, named for the friend who had helped Eleanor find herself again, had inherited her mother's love of music and her father's serious thoughtfulness, while little Rose, barely 3, possessed a stubborn independence that made both parents exchange knowing glances that said she would never allow herself to be invisible to anyone. The servants moved through the manor with smiles now, and Mrs. Hartwick often remarked to the younger maids that she had never seen such a transformation in all her years of service, that the Duke, who had once been so cold and distant, now looked at his wife as though she hung the moon and stars, and the Duchess, who had once moved through these rooms like a ghost, now filled them with such warmth and life that the very stones seemed to glow with contentment. Sebastian had kept his promise, those words spoken in the conservatory becoming the foundation upon which he rebuilt not just their marriage but himself, learning through patient practice how to be vulnerable, how to see not just Eleanor but everyone around him, how to let himself be seen in return without fear that visibility meant inevitable betrayal. Eleanor had learned something equally valuable, that her worth was not contingent upon being noticed by any particular person, that she could bloom in solitude if she must, that the courage to stop waiting for someone else's recognition and instead recognize herself was perhaps the greatest gift her months of invisibility had given her, though she would never wish such pain on anyone else. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the manor settled into peaceful darkness, Sebastian and Eleanor often found their way back to the conservatory, where it had all truly begun, and they would stand among the roses with their arms around each other, remembering that terrible, beautiful night when two people finally became real to one another, and Sebastian would whisper against her hair that he saw her, that he would always see her, and Eleanor would answer that she saw him too, that they had found each other not despite the pain but somehow through it, that the love they had built from patience and honesty and hard-won trust was more precious than any passion that had never been tested. Dear listener, Sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with passion but with patience, not with fireworks but with the slow, steady building of something real from the rubble of what was broken, and Eleanor and Sebastian's story reminds us that being truly seen is one of the most profound human needs. That invisibility is a special kind of death, even when we are surrounded by people, that we must have the courage to stop waiting for others to notice us and instead build lives of such authentic joy that we become impossible to ignore. If you have ever felt unseen in your own life, if you have ever stood in a room full of people and felt yourself disappearing, know that you deserve to be witnessed in all your complexity and beauty, that your worth does not depend on whether anyone else recognizes it, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop performing for an audience that refuses to watch and instead live so fully for yourself that you transform into someone even you barely recognize. May you find the courage Eleanor found to bloom in solitude. May you find the humility Sebastian discovered to tear down walls built from old wounds. May you surround yourself with people who truly see you, and may you have the wisdom to see them in return. And may you rest tonight, knowing that you are worthy of being loved, not for who you pretend to be, but for exactly who you are. This story was brought to you by Enchanted Ink Tales, and if these words have touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share this tale with someone who needs to hear that they deserve to be seen.